Hello, everyone. Today I'm here with Josh, and
Hey,
we're going to be talking about non-native mantises in the U.S. I'm Lohit, in case you didn't know. We're really excited to talk to you guys about this today. It's a pretty important topic, I think, and it's something that there's like a lot of confusion about. People aren't really sure how many species there are. What does it mean to be introduced or invasive or naturalized? And sort of maybe any concerns that are associated with having non-native species in our ecosystem. Those are just some of the things we're going to talk about today. So the first thing, just to clarify, is when something is non-native versus invasive versus naturalized. So typically, it's kind of like I kind of view it as like a sort of Venn diagram where you have non-native species that can be considered naturalized if they've been in a location for a long time, but then they can be considered invasive if they have noticeable negative effects on the environment. A common example being the emerald ash borer. It's a type of beetle that eats ash trees, and it's non-native, so it's obviously having a significant detriment to the ecosystem. In that case, to be considered invasive. It doesn't have to just affect another species, or it doesn't have to necessarily just feed on another species. It can also outcompete another species that's native, and push that species out. That can also be considered invasive. Um, so there's a couple of different ways to look at it, but generally anything that has a negative impact on this ecosystem can be considered invasive
yeah,
in a
and
particular ecosystem.
something else that comes up sometimes is like how capable a species that's non-native is of spreading. Like with some of the species we're going to talk about, they've only been located in one or two spots, and they've pretty much stayed there so far. But I feel like the most press goes to the endangered species that, or not endangered species, invasive species that start invading other areas, like the emerald ash borer. Say it had a small site of original origin in the United States, and after that, it goes wherever the ash trees go and leaves a path of destruction in its wake. Um, and so, like, is it? Do you know? Do people tend to use the term invasive species just for species that have the capability of increasing their range once they've been introduced, or is that more for the just the detrimental ones? Because I've heard it in the context of like spreading
No,
as
it can,
being one
yeah,
of the
it can
defining
also be
factors.
used for species that are expanding their range, even in some cases if they're native. So if,
Mm,
for example, if like a population of Stagmomantis carolina established itself in like the West Coast somewhere, they could be considered invasive because it's well outside of their native range.
yeah, and now they're spreading.
Yeah,
And for mammal cases, I've heard like armadillos and opossums both have spread further and further north in the United States. Opossums in the far past, but
Mhm.
armadillos currently expanding their range further north. And I suppose that could also be considered invasive as they go into places that they hadn't been in before.
Mhm.
But yeah, we're
I
not
don't know
talking
about
about mammals
armadillos.
today.
Yeah, no mammals here.
Gross.
I guess it's good to also talk about some of the ways that non-native mantises kind of arrive to different places. There's a number of ways that this happens. A lot of the times it's human mediated. So, like without realizing it, people will transport mantises or their egg cases to different places. And usually it's the egg cases that are the problem because they're the
Mm,
most hardy method of transportation for mantises. Egg cases can survive some pretty harsh conditions sometimes, and as long as the conditions are more or less favorable when they arrive to a particular place, and some of the nymphs can survive, then the mantises of that species are generally fine. So
you
some
get
of
a
these
whole breeding
examples,
population from one ooth.
exactly, yeah. A
Yeah.
lot of these ooths hatch like 50 plus 50 to 100, like 200 nymphs sometimes. So it's a lot of initial population size to work with. Um, some of these like methods of introduction can be like cargo ships. This is a very common one. I think I remember seeing a sighting of like a Hierodula paddlifera on like the docks in San Diego,
Oh,
and
wow.
it was dead because it was like on taken on a ship. So I assume it got stuck on the ship at one point and made it all the way across. But you can imagine that an egg case rather than a mantis would have a much better time of making it across the ocean, surviving.
Right.
It could also be land vehicles, people driving from one location to another, especially if it's across a great distance. And they stop somewhere for a while. A mantis decides that somewhere on their car is a good spot to lay an egg case, or even on their luggage. And the
Yep.
person gets off at a very different location. They get off, the luggage has, or the car vehicle now has the eggs. The eggs hatch in a completely new place. Another
I've seen pictures of
example,
that for sure. Mantises
yep,
laying
yep.
eggs right up, like above a tire on a car.
Yep, yep. And definitely like Christmas trees are another one. Sometimes Christmas trees
Mhm.
are brought from pretty far away. Chinese mantises are infamous for being on Christmas trees. They love those evergreens to lay in. Um, and then you also have, I think, I don't know of any examples of this to my knowledge, I think, but you can have cases of intentional release. I mean, with
Yeah.
not with mantises, but certainly with like some reptiles, for example, in Florida. I know several species have been intentionally released by people. I
Well,
don't know of
this,
any mantises specifically.
so for mantises, I mean, that comes up when people try to use them as pest control.
Right. That's
Um,
true. Yeah, 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 yeah.
which I mean, for mantises, it's typically ones that have already been introduced all over the place, like the
Right,
Chinese and
right,
and narrow winged that are used as pest control. But I
right.
did see Bug Guide reference that apparently European mantises were brought in specifically as a grasshopper pest control effort in like the 1930s to Canada,
Yes,
and
yes,
so
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah,
And
yeah.
then there are two that, and we'll talk about this more, but the random pet owners who decide, oh, they'd probably be happier outside and just let them go.
Right, right. Yeah. So yeah, there are a few cases, but I think the majority from what we know is that they arrived like through unintentional means, though
Yep.
sometimes it can be a combination of the above. Um, you can accident like maybe someone accidentally brings an ooth without realizing, and they're like, oh well, it's a bug, it goes outside, and then they release it somewhere completely else. Just as
Yeah.
an
Which I think also is like, that's kind of comforting in a way because it doesn't pin the blame on the hobby.
right.
But also it's a little extra scary because these potentially ecosystem affecting things happened without anybody noticing, probably directly under their noses.
Exactly.
And so it's a mixed bag when something is brought in accidentally like that and repeatedly shows that they can become established.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one thing that people haven't looked into too much yet is I know a lot of people, especially these past 2 years, like the plant hobby has gotten really big, and a lot of people are transporting plants from different places to different places,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes even internationally. And I wonder if that's responsible for anything that we might be seeing in the next few years.
So
Um,
pin the blame on the plant people sounds like a good
exactly.
strategy to me.
Exactly. I think oftentimes with these species, it's very likely that the first instance that we see them is not actually the first instance that we see them, more often
Mm,
than not, because mantises are hard to find anyway.
yeah.
Um, you're not going to see them until they're pretty well established, population wise, typically. So I think it's always good to keep in mind that whenever we see like a new introduced species, it's probably already been here for 5 years, maybe 10 even. And there's just not a lot of people documenting it. So
Yep.
uh, yeah. So with that, I guess it's good to talk about some of the introduced species that we found recently. And some
Yeah.
of these are as recent as last year, actually. So
Are we going to go in chronological order?
I guess you can go from the earliest. We can start early and then go to the most recent. Yeah,
That makes sense.
yeah. So yeah, as Josh mentioned at the start, Mantis religiosa, the European mantis, and Chinese mantises were brought in as sort of form of pest control, um, partially because they're big, I guess. I'm sure they hitched rides as well on cargo unintentionally, but they
Yep.
were introduced intentionally to some places for pest control. probably not the best idea, but people didn't really have a good sense of ecosystem impacts back then. So,
Mhm.
but how much range can a bug expand? Well, as the European mantis shows us, it can be almost everywhere. So,
Yep.
um, so yeah, so those are the big two, and those are probably the two that people often end up seeing the most often. I know for me personally, the first mantis I saw in the U.S. wasn't Stagma mantis limbata, the big native species. It was Mantis religiosa, and that's all I found
Mhm.
for the first 5-6 years I was looking for mantises. So and the Chinese mantises especially, I think moving to the East Coast, I hadn't really ever looked for mantises here, but I just say it's kind of shocking how many there are. Like it I found maybe like 20 or 30 individuals in just like the last 2 months of
Wow.
summer, and
Yeah.
it was a bit concerning considering how
It
big they are.
is. They're
I
a
gotta say,
they're a
um,
freaking sweet species, but
yeah, they're
when
very
they're
cool.
when they're all over the place, you're like, oh no.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon to see like 5, 6, 7 like large females just kind of hanging out in like a cluster of flowers, and you're like, wow, man, they must be eating a lot. Those are big guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I think Iris oratoria was first documented. I don't remember the exact date. I know there was a study in 2010 that was kind of discussing its range expansion. I know
Yeah.
that initially they were recorded in Southern California, if I remember correctly.
Yep. That
Um,
sounds familiar.
yeah, but I know now that they have expanded all the way down into like central Mexico. So they
Wow.
have an incredibly far range. Yeah, so that arid like corridor from like Central California down to Eastern Texas, down to Central Mexico is kind of like the area that they're hanging out in.
That definitely fits the characteristic of invasive that they're going to spread on their own.
Yeah. And I think one thing that helps them is they can lay a lot of eggs. I had females that lived like over a year as adults, and they would lay like regularly like 10, 12 egg cases, and each one hatches
Wow.
like 80 to 100 nymphs. So it can be like a lot.
With their productivity and the nice wing spots, it's kind of surprising they're not more of a hobby species.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's because the first instars are really small. They're similar
Oh.
to like to like your Yersinia nymphs actually. They're
Mm.
like bigger, but they look very similar. They even have like kind of grasshopper like legs. So I think it's just the size that makes them kind of difficult, and I think people don't really look at them too much because they're native, but I think they're pretty cool.
Did you just say
Uh,
native?
all right, natural. Yeah,
Yeah,
they're a species that's found natively.
indeed, indeed. Yeah, they're a neat one
um,
too. Look up
yeah,
Iris oratoria if you haven't seen it
yeah,
before. Good to
very
know.
cool. Really cool wing spots on their hind wings. Look like eyes.
But yeah, I feel like a lot of species, as I was doing sort of my prep refresher research for this video, the big four, like Tenodora, both species of Tenodora, the Mantis religiosa and Iris oratoria, were all introduced within like a 40-year period from like 1890 to 1930. And it was just, I don't know if that coincides with a change in shipping patterns or like the frequency that things were coming from certain countries or what, but it just seemed kind of odd to me that there was this short window of time in which four very prevalent mantis species ended up here.
It would be interesting to look at. I think definitely, like westward expansion and like international shipping patterns definitely may have played a part. I think I'm of the opinion that because Iris oratoria oots are so small and like innocuous, I think it was unintentionally brought
It,
here.
I would think
Um,
so.
Likely just on a ship, and just happened to find a place that it was like worked well for the nymphs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to look at. I wish like we had more recorded documentation of it, because I think there's a lot of like cool implications that like you can draw from like understanding where they came from and why they were brought there in the first place, if they
Yeah,
were brought purposefully.
but yeah, and it's those species that are the ones that lead some people to believe that there aren't any native United States mantises. Like I've had
Yeah.
several people Um, like just seeing them post on other things that, yeah, the US doesn't have any native mantises. And then I get to explain, oh, guess what? We do. They're awesome, but we don't see them as much. And here's why.
Right.
Those kinds of things. But yeah, what
I
are
mean,
some
it
of the more
certainly helps that the introduced species are much larger, so
they are?
you're more likely to notice them over the native species.
When I was a kid, I would always hope that I would find Tenodera over Stagmomantis because they're bigger and more impressive.
Right.
Little did I know. But yeah, what are some of the more recent ones, Lohit?
Yeah. So recently, going back, I think it was around 2014 or so, Acontista cordillerae and Liturgusa maya were found in Florida. And the consensus
Florida?
in
Invasive
Florida.
species there?
Who'd have thought?
Yeah.
Um, the consensus for these is still a little bit out because people are not sure, because both of these species are found in Mexico as well. And so people
Mm,
aren't sure if this is a case of human introduced populations. I mean, granted, it's very likely. There's probably a lot of people that are going back and forth between like places in Central America and Florida.
yeah.
Um, but it's also possible that this could be a case of earlier range expansion and then cut off. So like the ice age only ended about like 10,000 years ago or so. It's very possible that some of these species could have been much further north in their range, and then just given like shifts in the glacial pattern, and then as the final glacial wave came down, we had this sort of trapped population that's now existing in this suitable habitat because Florida is very tropical,
Yep.
southern Florida anyway, and it's not really found anywhere else because it's just been wiped out. So the consensus on it is still out. I don't know if anyone's working on it right now, but it's pretty interesting to think about. They're
It
pretty
is.
cool little species there.
Both those species, I mean, they're good candidates for being just in a location without being found, since they're
Mhm.
small and cryptic. And I don't know if either of them come to lights, but like the places where you're sampling in Florida, you very well just might pass over those. Um,
Yeah.
but I think it also isn't Acontista parthenogenetic.
Yeah, and actually Liturgusa Maya is as well,
Oh
apparently.
my gosh.
So
Okay. So that
so
helps.
yeah, so for people who don't know, parthenogenesis is when organisms can reproduce asexually. So there doesn't need to be a male in the population for them to have offspring. But the caveat is all the offspring will be clones of the mother. So they'll all be female, they'll have the exact same genetic makeup. The benefit to this is you don't have to worry about finding a mate. So, if you're an isolated population and mates are hard to come by, you can still reproduce and build the population without a mate. But you are more susceptible to things like disease, for example. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I could see that, especially like if you imagine a scenario in which a single Liturgusa ooth makes it over to Florida, whether by person or by hurricane or whatever,
Mhm.
and if that hatches out, even if only females survive, or if there's, say, 2 males and 6 females that survive, each male finds one female, and then the other 4 still get to reproduce. Like that just
Yep.
makes your chances of sticking around so much higher.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's definitely like an interesting strategy, and it's probably why they were able to persist there, regardless of how they got there, because it's always beneficial
Yeah. And
to have that ability.
Florida's a mean competitive ecosystem too, with all the lizards and other insect predators there too.
Yep, and Gonatista griseia is a native bark mantis species.
Mhm.
Liturgus has to compete with those guys, and it's
Yeah.
smaller. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah. So moving out of Florida, what do we
Yeah,
have that other people may
go
encounter?
back to Southern California. This one is a really restricted species, and interestingly, it's also parthenogenic. Maya mantis caphra. So this is a South African mantis. It's actually invasive in 2 places now, or introduced in 2 places.
Mhm.
Definitely invasive in New Zealand. New Zealand only has one endemic mantis species, the New Zealand mantis Orthodera novazelandae. And it's really detrimental to those mantises because when they've evolved in an environment where there aren't multiple species and they don't need to worry about having a precise chemical signal to find a mate, then they're willing to mate with almost anything. And so Orthodera males will waste energy and sometimes their lives trying to mate with a Myomantis female, who are often much bigger than
Yeah.
Orthodera. and they end up getting eaten. So it's a pretty big problem there. In California, it doesn't seem to be as big of an issue because they're very restricted. They're only really hugging the southern coastal region of California, where it's pretty humid and warm year round. And they're about the size of the native species Stagmomantis limbata and smaller than Mantis religiosa. So it seems like they aren't really able to expand much more since they were documented around 2010.
Oh
I
yeah.
think. So yeah, so hopefully they stay there and don't expand their range anymore.
Right.
uh, yeah. Really interesting little species. They're pretty similar looking to Stagmomantis, so oftentimes people will just confuse the two. But you can tell Myomantis apart pretty easily because it's got some bright blue spots on its forecoxa, on its front segment of the forelimb there. And the ooth shape is a little bit different. The mantis has a slightly different head shape, so some small differences there.
Yeah, they're funky little dudes. I'm just about to get Stagmomantis limbata, native
Nice.
Southwest US little buddy out here.
Nice.
But yeah, that's another that probably not very many viewers would be able to encounter in your area. Of course, if you do, what would you recommend people do with non-native mantises that they find?
Well, generally, I think it's better to not promote more populations of non-native species. So I think if you find a non-native individual, it's probably best to euthanize it and donate it to like University UC Riverside is in the region. You can donate it to them. I know that there is a couple people that are looking at Myomantis capra there.
The active studies.
Talk to someone there. Yeah. That would be good. I mean, you can always just, euthanize it and like just throw it away, but I think donating it to a scientific research group is always better.
That's what I was hoping for. That there'd be somebody like that who would be interested in knowing where you found it or what you needed to, where you needed to take it.
And definitely, if you have the ability to posting it on Anatrails is always good. A lot of researchers do use it to check kind of the ranges of things because it's not always feasible to like go everywhere to collect, and even when you do, you might not find what you're looking for. So having people just document what's in their backyards is pretty helpful. So
yeah. Speaking of finding what you're looking for, have you had any success finding the East Coast most recent invasive?
I have not. I know I haven't looked too terribly hard, but it doesn't seem like there's many up in my part of Baltimore. But Statilia maculata is a species that's introduced, I think, around 2017, 2016 was when they were first documented.
Asian jumping mantis is the name they're going by, apparently, which is so specific.
Yeah, they don't particularly jump any more than a regular mantis does.
That's what I'm thinking. Terrible name.
They're pretty cool. They're kind of like a slimmer Mantis religiosa is kind of how they look. They have these spots on their forefemurs. So imagine a mantis limb on this part of the arm.
A nice tattoo right on the underarm.
And it's got like red and white and a little bit of black. So it's pretty easy to distinguish them. I know at the moment there's 2 confirmed populations in Baltimore itself and in New York. They've been found in both places, and I think there was another population found in another location in between, somewhere in Philadelphia, I think, like Eastern Philadelphia. But
from what I've seen of that species in its natural habitat of East Asia, it seems like they're really good at living around people and like in city and disturbed habitats.
Yeah, and that might be why they're doing so well in sort of these bigger cities, but not able to like kind of expand everywhere else. They've certainly been here for a while, but again, it's always hard to say with mantises because it could just be a case of poor sampling. Like, maybe we just need more people to get out there and look because maybe they're out there and we don't know.
More people who know what they look like.
Yeah, more people who know what they look like. Exactly. That's the other part of it. Yeah.
Gosh. Especially with nymphs, though. Like sometimes I can't blame people. You find a random nymph in the field, you're not the kind of person who's going to raise it, and so you go, it's probably a native one. But
yeah,
it's pretty key to have samplers who can identify these things and be able to truly say what it is.
Exactly, because there's no other way to like track the populations otherwise.
Yeah.
Um, and
Put
yeah,
little radio
so
collars on them.
that would be pretty cool.
I mean, honestly, that'd be awesome. I would love
If
to
you
see
can make
this
one
video.
that's small enough, it'd be like tracking like mini lions,
It'd be so cool.
mini tigers or something. But yeah, it's like I know they've been found in the same habitat as, you know, like Chinese mantises and Carolina mantises. So it it might just be that they prefer big cities and disturbed habitats, like you said, and like that's probably maybe why we don't see them as often like in the area in between.
Mm.
But I think it's interesting that there's sort of these like two or three like very different sites that they are found at that are pretty far apart, because that means that there was multiple cases of introduction, most
Oh,
likely.
gee, you're right.
um I don't know how, but
Yeah, that's
I mean,
very odd.
yeah, I mean, the species is found from, you know, it's found from eastern China, in Japan, and parts of like Southeast Asia as well. So um it, your guess is as good as mine. It could have been from almost anywhere.
Yeah,
So
and I suppose that it always could have been one original site of entering the country and then
yeah,
secondarily moved by vehicle or
it's also
something like
true.
that too.
That's also very true. Yeah. Yeah, it'd be good. It'd be cool to see if someone can do like a genetic examination to see like what the relationships between the
That
populations
would
are.
that would solve some problems.
Yeah,
It would also, now that I'm thinking about it, tell us quite a bit about inbreeding if it turns out that some of these invasives who end up living for a long time here all came from one individual or one population originally.
yeah, that'd be really cool to look at. What you got there? Pseudocanthops?
Full
Yeah,
acanthops.
full
Acanthops are also a female, hanging on by 2 feet while she pretends to be a leaf.
of.
I'm still in love with this one. She just matured. I've never had an acanthopid before,
They're really
and
cool.
it's really cool.
Yeah.
Highly recommend acanthops, pseudacanthops, Metelia. But how about we talk about the species that inspired us to even do this video?
Oh, yeah, and this one might be one of the worst.
This
For the
is,
location.
yeah,
Um,
things have been cheery up until now.
yeah.
It's serious time.
So yeah, I don't remember when exactly that sighting was, but it was last year sometime.
Yeah,
Um,
we've been putting this off for a little while. Sorry,
a little
guys.
while. But yeah, I remember. So in Arizona, there is one confirmed sighting of Sphaeromantis viridis. For people who don't know, Sphaeromantis viridis is found almost everywhere throughout and around the Mediterranean. So northern Africa, southern Europe, you know, parts of Spain, parts of southeastern Europe. Yeah,
Giant African mantis in the hobby.
yeah,
Yeah.
giant African mantis. And so this species is really tolerant of a wide variety of conditions. It has a lot of nymphs, and probably the worst part of it is it's much bigger than any native species. Um, it's pretty close to the size of like a European mantis, or maybe like a slightly smaller Tenedera,
Yeah.
but much bulkier. So this is a very aggressive generalist species. And the problem with it being in Arizona is Arizona, for people who haven't been there, has a climate that's very similar to parts of Spain. So it has a very warm and wet summer. It has a pretty moderate, slightly cold winter, which is fine because the Sphaeromantis viridis don't care; they'll die of pause.
Yep.
And lots of insects. So it's a great place to be if you're a very hardy species
A
and
big aggressive
a big
mantis.
aggressive species, because there's a lot for you to eat there and good growing conditions for you to live there.
Yep.
And so right now there was one individual that was found. I think it was on the University of Arizona campus.
Yeah.
I guess on the campus is kind of weird, but
That makes me even more concerned for
yeah,
how it got there,
yeah, yeah.
honestly.
And so because it's one sighting, I mean, in all likelihood, it's probably not just one, and it's probably been there for a while, and we just didn't know.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's problematic.
Yeah, and this is as a lot of you probably have observed, Sphaeromantis is a common hobby pet. and it's a pretty common research animal as well. And so when I see like one adult found on a campus, I think either, okay, this got out from a bug zoo somewhere or a lab, or somebody released their pet. And that sucks because it puts the blame on a keeper rather than just on, oh, someone didn't check the plant thoroughly enough, or an accident like that.
Exactly. And I think I did read that Viridis specifically is also facultatively pathogenic, though not to the same degree as something like Acontista, where like all the
Yeah,
eggs are viable. I think it's like it has a reduced number of offspring, but it can still hatch like some nymphs. So
I've read that as well. Like they're not good at being parthenogenic, but they kind of can be.
yeah. So again, just like another thing that contributes to that like persisting even better.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is the most recent one. Again, I think iNaturalist is a great site for that reason, because if that person just hadn't decided to upload a picture of that mantis, that we would never have known. So
Yeah. And
uh,
whether it ends up staying or not, like it's really important to try to document these as soon as they appear, as fast as possible, so
exactly.
that we can understand what happened. But that's the species that made us really want to do this video months ago, because we're a hobby that's growing in size and growing in relevance, especially as mantises start to overlap more with reptile keepers and fish keepers and other animal hobbies. They're coming into the mainstream, and invasive non-native species are a huge PR problem if we don't have a very strong and united stance on this.
Exactly. And it's just detrimental to our ecosystem to have more and more non-native species running around. We
Oh,
don't
big
want our
picture
native
stuff. You're right.
other than seeing cool pictures. We don't
Oh
want to
no,
see.
no, I mean big picture, like
Oh yeah,
ecosystem
yeah.
as opposed to just our pet keeper
Right,
problems.
right. Yeah, big picture ecosystem.
Yeah.
But yeah, we don't want to see like our native species gone either. Whether it's mantis or non-mantis, we want to keep our ecosystem as conserved and protected as possible. And we have a responsibility as keepers to be responsible as well, responsibly enjoying our mantises.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've talked about some of the factors that lead to a non-native species being able to persist in a climate. If you're going to like sum up the factors that a species would have to have a good shot at succeeding in a new place, how would you sum that up?
Yeah, so I'd say one of the first things is probably just being a generalist. I mean, a lot of the species that we looked at are pretty generalist. They'll be on a variety of different kinds of foliage. I mean, they do have maybe preferences in terms of the height of the foliage, for example, but they
Right.
typically don't care about a specific plant. They're not mimicking something specifically. They can come in a variety of different colors, so they don't necessarily need to be on or in an environment that has a certain type of foliage again. And they don't specifically have like a unique style of prey capture mechanism, at least insofar as like something like Thesprotiella, the spearing mantis, for example, they don't have any capture system like that. So they're pretty generalist. They'll eat most things, they'll go after most things, they'll lay on most places, they'll kind of hang out wherever. As
Mhm.
long as things are more or less suitable, they're okay. And I think another thing is the ability for them to tolerate new climates. I think if you look at a lot of where these species came from, they are living now in the US in habitats that are very similar to places that they're found originally.
Mhm.
Um, so for example, European mantis, again, is found all throughout Europe, it's found all throughout Asia and in parts of Africa as well. And guess what? It's found in similar conditions in the US. It's found in pretty moderate to sometimes arid deserts. It's found in the very northern parts of the US and southern Canada, where there's long winters, just like northern Europe.
Right.
So a lot of these species are occupying similar regions or like climatic regions that are similar to their native ranges. So, and species that have big ranges can live in most places. So
Yep.
that's what a lot of these species are. Wide ranges, ability to tolerate different climates. And the last thing is all of these species are able to have a large number of offspring. So this is referred to as fecundity, is how many offspring an organism can have. And all of these species regularly lay multiple egg cases over their lifetime. All of these egg cases tend to hatch at least 50 nymphs, most of the times more, usually 100 plus. And when you're a new species in a new place, and your population size is small, having the number game, a numbers game on your side makes a big difference in whether you're able to survive or not. It's much more likely if you have a small population size that out of 100 nymphs, more will survive to adult than if you only had 20. It's just a higher risk.
Yep.
So yeah, and all of these species that we talked about, again, minus the Acontista and the Liturgusa, they all have this trait. So they're all really good competitors and able to, survive in these new environments pretty well.
Yeah, I think I can't think of anything else that would say that better. Is the ones that are most likely to spread aren't the orchids and dragons of the mantis world. They're the tough, basic body type ones who are already in many different environments. And I've seen some stories of Chinese mantises in particular with how United States doesn't necessarily have their preferred climate in all of the places where they're released. Sometimes the egg cases will hatch at the first sort of thaw of winter, and then it freezes again and all the nymphs die. And so some of these species, they may end up becoming persistent in like pockets of habitat that do work well for them. But unless they're continually being released, like Chinese narrow-winged other species used as pest control, they may not end up succeeding in all of those different climates.
Right. Yeah, and the Chinese is a great example because I mean, in Davis, for example, there's records of Chinese mantises being collected there every year until about the 60s or so. And it's probably because they were being released for agricultural control. And, on a farmland, they do great, but then it's just too dry later in the summer. So they probably just all die out. The egg cases dry out. They need much like more moist conditions than what Davis, for example, has. But in the Bay Area of California, there's some places where there's consistent populations of Chinese mantises because it's wet year round or more moist year round. So don't dry out as much. So yeah, there are these like definitely like these like sort of like even like small localized differences can make a big difference in whether a population is going to make it or not.
Good point. Yeah. So one of the big questions that comes up pretty often, and especially is written about in mainstream news media, is how much of an impact do these species have in actuality?
Right.
When it comes to non-native species, there are a few stories that anybody familiar with ecology at least a little bit knows. Starlings are one. They're that bird with the little star sort of sparkly patterns on their black body. And they were one who was introduced in the United States intentionally early on and has spread all over the place and forms gigantic flocks and pulls other baby birds out of the nest and does all these nasty little things. They're a bad one. Cane toads in Australia, a giant amphibian, which is toxic to all the native predators, also really bad, also a common like cautionary tale for introducing non-native species. And domestic cats are a pretty hot topic right now. They're also extremely destructive to environments when they're allowed to roam free and unchecked, and a highly controversial one because people love cats, which is easy to understand as well. But I feel like the benign non-native species don't get as much attention. The ones that are just sort of slotted into the ecosystem and play a part don't really shake things up too much or may even benefit. Some examples of species like this in the United States are house geckos, which are the little lizard that's all over the South, the pinkish translucent one, which lives on your walls and eats your cockroaches and doesn't seem to impact the environment a great deal. The tamarisk tree is a very common amphibious tree, which provides great nesting space for a lot of birds, including some threatened or endangered species in the US. And dung beetles are an Australian example, where a lot of different dung beetle species were brought in to help the environment cope with dairy farming, and really saved a lot of Australia by removing all that waste. And so with those sort of extremes of very, very disruptive or not a problem at all, where do mantises seem to fall on that spectrum?
It's a big open-ended question right now. There's not a lot of
That is.
research done. Yeah, I mean, what have you noticed in terms of, like, I mean, you're in Texas, so there's a ton of native mantis species, but
Yep.
you guys also get Iris oratoria in some places. I don't know if you've found any.
I haven't seen any iris, but I think I live
Okay.
too northeast for that.
Okay, yeah, they're pretty far to the east.
I'm in an interesting spot in Fort Worth where we primarily have natives there. Stagmomantis carolina is by far the most commonly encountered. I know that there are Chinese mantises nearby. I haven't seen any yet. I hopefully will be able to spot some this summer on some expeditions, but I haven't seen any. I don't think they're very prevalent in Northeast Texas, but they are there, at least somewhat. I haven't seen Mantis religiosa at all, and I don't know where the nearest sort of suitable habitat would be that they haven't been probably outcompeted by some of the native predators. We've got a lot of pretty strong invert predators around here that will eat mantises.
Yeah.
And so I feel like at least some parts of Texas, the natives are equipped to take out the invasives.
Right. Yeah. I can't imagine that Tenodare is going to have a good time versus a red-eyed devil kitty.
Nope, they lose most of the time.
Yeah.
But like that is a factor as well, is that mantises are a species which are prey as well as predator. And so when I look at their impact on the environment, you do have to pay attention to the fact that they're also, in a way, providing a resource for other animals to take advantage of. And so at least in places with enough other predators that are going to want a big insect, like a female Chinese mantis will eat so many smaller animals, but she herself is also a great meal. If a bird is feeding its nesting young, that's going to fill them up for a while if they can catch a female Chinese. And so it's kind of a mixed bag with these mantises, that they can impact native invertebrates and other small predators and stuff as well. But then they also are eaten, and they occur in pretty low densities because they eat each other too. I think the cannibalism, if mantises were not cannibalistic, they would be far greater of a problem than they are currently.
Yeah. That is one of the good things about mantises is that they are cannibalistic. So, even if like one species is present in like large numbers, it's probably going to be feeding upon itself a decent bit. And that does help regulate the population from becoming too common or taking over an ecosystem, is that in a way they're sort of self-limiting.
Right.
I mean, occasionally the damage can still be done depending on what they're eating, but generally for most things that are pretty abundant, they're not going to be able to have too large of an impact on their own.
There haven't been a lot of focused studies on this subject, though. I feel like a lot of it's anecdotes.
Exactly. But we do have some studies on some of the effects of mantises being in the area and how they affect other organisms, right? So so there was a study, I think it was 2014 or 2015, that looked at Chinese mantises and the impact that they had on a local species of wolf spider, or a native species of wolf spider. And they found that, when mantises were in the area, the wolf spiders would forage in that area a lot less. So even if the mantis is not directly eating these spiders, their presence alone is kind of scaring the spiders away from hunting there, which obviously has effects on whether the spider is able to survive, whether it's able to find enough food. The more mantises there are, the less area it has to hunt safely.
It's pretty remarkable.
So yeah, there's definitely some effects. I think, like, personally, some things that I've seen anecdotally is in California, when in areas that I find Mantis religiosa and Stagmomantis limbata together, Mantis religiosa is almost always pretty close to the ground. It's always laying its eggs like close to the ground under rocks oftentimes,
Mhm.
or like on the corners underneath buildings. And Sagomantis limbata is very much different. So it's laying its eggs much higher up in the trees, sometimes 10 to 20 feet up, sometimes in some cases. It's usually higher up in the foliage. But when I went to Arizona, one thing that was interesting is I didn't see any Mantis religiosa there, but there's tons of Sagomantis limbata, and they would also lay their eggs close to the ground and under rocks and hang out close to the ground as well. And so
Yep,
my
that's interesting.
suspicion is that Mantis religiosa being there is having a non-consumptive effect. So it's not necessarily feeding on the limbata, though it might, but by being there, it's kind of scaring the limbata off from occupying this area of the foliage.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, I
and
noticed limbata laying in a lot of similar places in far west Texas, where they're
Mhm.
the biggest mantis around. They have free reign of the habitat.
Right. And before the introduced species, they were they
Yeah,
were the biggest one. Sagomantis limbata do get pretty big, but not compared to Mantis religiosa. So it's kind of interesting to think about how these organisms, these new non-native species being here, have kind of shaped how the native species have behaved over time, especially because some of them have been here for hundreds of years. So
yeah.
very interesting to think about.
And I think we do need to look at it too in the context of many different threats coming toward these native species. Something that I encountered a lot growing up in Iowa was the difference in habitat between Chinese mantises and the native Stagmomantis carolina. And the Carolinas would be found in areas I knew where it was. I mean, as a kid, I could walk to a certain part of the city if I wanted to find Carolinas, and I'd have a good shot at finding them. And I would walk over to a different part if I wanted to find Chinese. But the fact is that if the Chinese weren't there, the Carolinas would probably be in more spots.
Exactly.
And so
Yeah.
if you have a species which is under duress from an invasive species, it might be one more push from either another species or another chemical or another building that gets put up that could be enough to take them out of that area completely. And granted, it's a local thing, but on the scale of humans transforming the environment overall, it's another stressor that they really don't need.
Exactly. Yeah. Like just like Josh said, like over time, these like small local instances add up and you get regional population losses or changes.
Yep.
And so, we always have to be kind of we have to always consider like, even if the introduced species aren't necessarily eating the mantises, just the native mantises, just the fact that they're even pushing them out of a certain space or competing for the same resources in some cases, that can be enough to negatively affect a population. It really just depends on the population how they respond to it.
Yeah.
It's important to keep that in mind. Yeah.
And so as we kind of wrap up this discussion, we've covered a whole lot of different
Yeah.
things as part of this topic, but it does also boil down to our personal responsibility, whether or not there is measurable damage being done by non-native mantises at this point. I think it's pretty easy to agree that even though it might on the surface be cool to be able to walk out in your yard and find, for instance, a ghost or an orchid, we know that in practice, we don't want that. We want to
Yeah.
go to where those species naturally occur and see them there. We don't want to make the world sort of a homogeneous jumble of species that somebody might want to release or somebody might think were neat if they were there. And so we have a very important responsibility to keep our animals where they belong, which is in their own habitats or in human care.
Exactly.
And
And
with mantises, like it's tough keeping track of all of them when you're hatching out nymphs. Like,
yep.
are there any things that you can think of that would be helpful for people to not accidentally let their mantises out?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I do is I usually have like a hatch cup, and then once they hatch in the hatch cup, I usually let them settle down for a day or two, and that usually helps kind of calm them down because I think the first day or two they're kind of running everywhere, and it's very easy to lose them when you're transferring them at that stage.
Mm-hmm.
And then after they settle down a little bit, it becomes much easier to move them. And I always open the hatch cup into a bigger container or
Double
something like that.
containment.
Yeah, just to make sure that if something gets out, it's not going to be able to run away somewhere where I can't find it again.
Yep.
And like even with that, sometimes you do get like the odd escapee, and that like happens just because they hatch so many sometimes. But
Sometimes.
it's yeah, it definitely helps much more than just moving them, open cup and trying to like wrangle them all and then moving them one at a time to somewhere.
Yep.
Um,
I'll
yeah,
be a
definitely
lot
recommend a catch container of sorts.
I'll be a lot more lax when I breed native species, like where they get to go, than when I have
Mhm.
exotics. Like for my walking sticks, I raise native Texas walking sticks. They live outside. If one gets out, no biggie. Like I keep a container of those out on my porch, a big net cage, and if a baby finds a hole in the screen and gets out, that's totally fine. I'm not going to keep a hatch of Asian mantises out on my porch. Like
Exactly.
it's common sense sometimes is all it takes
Yeah.
to prevent something from getting out.
Yeah, it's literally just that, right? It's common sense. Like if it's not found there, it shouldn't, you shouldn't be putting it there. That's
Exactly.
basically the rule that you want to follow.
Yeah.
And as hobbyists, we want to make sure that we're doing what we can for mantises, as a whole, right? It's not just about like having a bunch of species easy to find in your yard. It's about doing what's best for the ecosystem. Because I mean, ultimately, like
Yep.
us keeping the mantises is benefiting them in a way that if they were lost in their native habitat, we have captive populations that can, be sustained. And
Hmm.
what we don't want is we lose native species and instead have a bunch of introduced species, and then no one will be able to keep mantises anyway because then they'll be very regulated because they're causing a lot of problems. So
Yes.
we want to make sure that we're being responsible and we're monitoring and maintaining, populations of non-native species so that they don't get out because they can cause a really big problem. As we talked about earlier, some of these species are much larger and much more aggressive and can expand to a pretty big range compared to native species. And this can not only affect like the other mantises, but they can also affect other animals, right? So we talked about how much a mantis eats. Everyone who's kept mantises knows that mantises can eat a lot. And you imagine
Yep.
how many organisms a single individual is going to eat over its lifetime that a native species or another native animal could have eaten or interacted with, or that organisms that they ate could have benefited the environment in some way are now not there. That's a big gap in the food web that these mantises are kind of pulling.
Yep.
So we just want to be mindful that we're not, making things already harder than it is for animals in our ecosystem.
Absolute. Wow. You just bailed. I'm sorry about that little one. But yeah, and I think of it too, like as an ambassador for insects when I go out and do shows and whatnot. Um, I'm trying to improve public opinion of these animals, and that goes from everybody in government as well as just everyday people. We want to be able to show that every insect has an important role, and if they're already taking up like negative space in the media, if people are seeing, oh no, the mantises are eating all of our hummingbirds in the news, that's going to be a pretty tough hurdle to overcome if you're trying to show someone, look at my cute pet, isn't she great? That's going to form a negative
Yeah,
opinion from the start.
definitely.
But yeah, so we hope that this video will have taught you something new and that you guys will have an expanded perspective on non-native mantises in the US. There is still a whole lot of work to be done on this subject, and hopefully we won't need to do a whole lot more work done in the future. Once we understand the species that are currently here, hopefully we will be able to prevent others from establishing themselves as well.
That is the goal.
Yeah. So until next time, see you guys later on the group. Bye.
All right.